There we go.
Everyone, I'm Misha Mehta, a mom to Neve and co-founder of Neve Colte and Brave Ronald Foundation. I also serve on the board of CAC2 and co-lead this webinar series with Nicole Scobie. Thank you everyone for joining today on this important session with Dr. Ratmel on the evolving federal funding landscape for biomedical research, especially as it impacts pediatric cancer. Recent federal budget changes have resulted in cuts in several key initiatives supporting childhood cancer research. Proposed policy changes, such as capping indirect costs on NIH grants, threaten to restrict resources for research institutions and clinical trials that are essential for advancing new therapies and improving outcomes for children with cancer. In this rapidly changing environment, the role of patient advocates has never been more vital. Patient advocates and organizations are stepping up to bridge funding gaps, shaping research priorities, and ensure the needs and voices of patient families are heard at every step of policy as well as research. Before we dive into this webinar, a few quick housekeeping notes. Please keep your microphones on mute to minimize any background noise. We encourage your questions. Enter them in the chat at any time, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. And Dr. Ratmel has been graciously kind enough to give us more time if we need to answer all the questions. We can go beyond the top of the hour as well. This session is being recorded and will be available on the CAC2 website along with all the speaker details. Special thanks to the RIGS team, especially Lacey, for managing all the behind the scenes logistics and marketing. A couple quick announcements. Registration is open for the annual CAC2 Summit. Details can be found on our newsletters, on our website, as well as our social media channels. Keep an eye on for our next upcoming webinar on fertility and fertility preservations in childhood cancer. It's going to be on May 13th at noon Eastern. Jenny, next slide, please. At CAC2, we always begin by affirming our core values, putting children and family first, respecting every organization and individuals in our community, striving for efficiency and inclusivity, amplifying our impact through collaboration, and staying action-oriented and flexible. These principles guide everything we do. Next slide, please, Jenny. This is our agenda for today. I am going to, Dr. Ratma is going to have a brief presentation, and we're going to have a majority of a chunk for question and answers. It is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Ratmel, a visionary leader and one of the most influential physician scientists in American oncology today. Dr. Ratmel was recently appointed as the incoming CEO of the Ohio State University Comprehensive Cancer Center, Arthur G. James Cancer Hospital, and Richard J. Solve Research Institute, where she will also serve as the inaugural Jerry B. Block and Robert Schlossenstein Distinguished Chair in Cancer, a $10 million endowed position. Dr. Ratmel's appointment at Ohio State follows her impactful tenure as the 17th director of the National Cancer Institute. At the NCI, Dr. Ratmel was renowned for her bold initiatives, including the launch of early onset of cancer initiatives, which advanced precision medicine and addressed rise cancer rates amongst young population, while also championing efforts to reduce disparities in cancer care across underserved and rural communities. Her leadership was marked by her commitment to expanding clinical trial access, fostering data-driven innovation, and ensuring equity in cancer research and treatment. Prior to her national leadership, Dr. Ratmel also served as a physician-in-chief and chair of the Department of Medicine at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Her scientific achievements are extraordinary. She has authored over 300 peer-reviewed articles in top journals and has been a driving force in the Cancer Genome Atlas Kidney Cancer Projects, earning the 2020 AACR Team Science Award and numerous other prestigious honors, including the American Cancer Society Medal of Honor. Dr. Ratmel's career is a testament to the power of combining scientific rigor, compassionate care, strategic leadership, her vision and expertise will undoubtedly shape the future of cancer research and patient care at Ohio State and beyond. Welcome, Dr. Atma.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. And this is a really important time to have conversations like this. There are a lot of things that are happening in the ecosystem of cancer and pediatric cancer, especially. I was commenting a little bit as before we started that I was just listening, in fact, to an appropriations hearing that was focused on biomedical research. It included a pediatric patient advocate, and her daughter joined her as well, to put the real light on what the issue is, as well as some of the leading investigators in cancer and biomedical research. So these kinds of dialogues are happening at all levels, and it's really important that we understand the facts and can also be able to critically get into the nuances. So with that, let me get my slides up. So here we go. There we go. And does that look right for you? Just before I start? Okay, great. I'm gonna just turn my thing so it looks like I'm looking at you and not over at the other screen because it's hopping over to my other. Okay. So now that I'm here, though, we practice putting it up. There we go, but didn't want to go forward. So let's start with some things that are really good. So pediatric cancer has been making real strides in individual cancers for which there are vastly improved therapies, better outcomes. We have better ecosystems for treatment around the country, better collaborations across a lot of different spaces. And so there's also a lot more attention has started to be focused on pediatric cancer, much in part to your efforts. And that makes a big difference. So I also want to say that the NCI's annual report to the nation just came out last week. It's worth taking a look at. I have the link there for anybody who wants to plug it in and go through. But the very highest level part for pediatric cancer shows the decrease in death rates, 1.5% per year for children, which sounds like a small number, but is actually a very significant improvement because death from cancer is actually much less for children than it is for adults. And so continuing to make improvements on that is absolutely vital. And it shows that there continues to be a lot of strong efforts over this time. So as you all know, there are also gaps and challenges that we face as we think about how to make real inroads for pediatric cancer. I put in bigger and bolder letters the rarity of disease. All rare diseases are by definition harder to manage for multiple reasons that we can get into over the whole course of my remarks. I have been focused on rare diseases throughout my career and have to just say it is harder to do. The community is smaller. The tools that you have to work with in terms of model systems or other biorepositories are by nature smaller or sometimes non-existent and have to be created. And there can be sometimes a perception that if we study the big ticket items, that we get better bang for our buck. I actually disagree with that very much. I think that you get real output from studying things in big diseases, but also you can learn things that you might never have expected by studying rare diseases. And those will be applicable more broadly once we understand them. So it's the surprises that can actually move fields dramatically forward. And studying in rare disease is an opportunity for that, as well as the opportunity to have a more discrete set of patients to be able to make real advances for. Often diagnosis can be late in pediatric cancer because these are not symptoms that are necessarily always being looked for. The treatment options can be more limited. There can be differences in the way treatment is offered in underrepresented populations or due to geography or other barriers. There are significant financial burdens to families, um, and um, and the financial creation of the healthcare system is really not designed around care for in the pediatric um, population as well, and then need for additional advocacy. And what you all are doing is actually, this is going to be the punchline at my end. It is where it's necessary for the foundations that focus on a unique cancer to band together, because otherwise the voice can be um, too easily drowned out. So I thought I'd actually start with a patient story of how one way that I found myself being interested in rare cancers. So I'm a kidney cancer doctor. It actually meets the criteria of rare, but this is adult kidney cancer, and it's um, not all that rare. But there are subtypes of kidney cancer that are extraordinarily rare. About 10 or 15 different subtypes that fall into this category of even the kidney cancer doctors don't see them all that often. So the story that got me into this field was a patient who showed up in my clinic as a I'm an adult cancer doctor, and uh, opened the door to the clinic, and it was a 18-year-old and his mom, and he was the one with cancer, and he had recently had a very large kidney tumor removed, and they were having some trouble with the wound. The conventional therapies for conventional type kidney cancer at the time were largely impacted wound healing, and so there was a challenge there, and so that's the only reason he came to my clinic is because the uh, 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 community didn't know what to do beyond that. What is obvious probably is that 18-year-olds don't usually get kidney cancer, and so it seemed like more likely that he had one of the rare subtypes. But on further discussion, we discovered that his father had died from HIV that he'd contracted from blood transfusion for his sickle cell disease, which makes by definition that this young man had sickle cell trait. He had not been aware of that fact, had otherwise been healthy until that point in time. And so that's a setup for a very, very rare subtype of kidney cancer called renal medullary carcinoma, one I had only read about in textbooks and had never seen. It's actually classified as a pediatric malignancy. Most cases happen in kids between the ages of 10 and 20. So he's 18. So um, I'll try to keep this story a little bit short, but there was not any known effective therapies for this cancer. We ended up making a lot of phone calls and creating some network around the handful of kids that there were in the country with that disease at the time. And some of us in the country put together a cocktail of chemotherapies that causes regression in this tumor, which had not been ever demonstrated before. According to the literature, survival rates were under 4 months. And, this young man was 2 months into his journey at the time that he met me. He did live for about a year. It was not enough. He, uh, uh, he and his mother and I spoke during the time when he was on hospice about really the many gaps that were in his way. The fact that he was falling between pediatric and adult, the fact that he's a young Black man who was ignored when he had symptoms for quite some period of time. That the disease was so rare that no one seemed to know what to do with it, even when they went to an academic center and places where there were kidney cancer doctors. The fact that he was being raised in a single parent home because of other medically induced and financial inequities in their family because of his father's passing, and kind of all of these reasons that she said you cannot just let this go and move on to the next patient. So I wrote a paper with some of these other people, and that got picked up by um, someone who was more active on social media and an advocate for this cancer. And the long story short is that we got together, had a meeting of the 12 or 20 people who know anything about this cancer, developed some guidelines so that anyone in the country would know where to start. We developed a communication strategy so that when a kid is diagnosed with this cancer, a local doctor will be able to recognize it and will be able to know where to find some good information and a referral source. We organized our own 501(c)(3) so that we had a foundation so that we could really try to get funding for this organization, but for this cancer, but mostly tried to convince others like the Department of Defense or even the NCI to commit around this cancer type. And it's different today. There's still not a cure, but we understand the biology in a really significant way. These kids now can expect a survival that's closer to 2 years. So we're making impressive gains. Again, not enough. There's a clue that is a paper that came out earlier this year that suggests a way to screen, and there is a subset population that is at risk. So I tell you this story because it was one patient who had introduced me to where rare tumors could really reorient my whole way of thinking, and as well where the influence of community, of dialogue with advocates and stakeholders could make a huge difference, and where nationwide partnerships could change some of the outcome. I'm going to come back to this story in just a minute, but that is one experience that I had that really made me realize that pediatric and rare tumors were an important place to pay some attention. But as I pointed out, there were a lot of mismatches in pediatric adult, in the disease itself. And so how do we resolve these mismatches? So first, we often think about the next steps in these by talking about how we fund this kind of cancer research. And I apologize, I have a dog barking. Hopefully you can't hear her. Someone rang the doorbell, but traditionally, we think about for pediatric cancer, I'll start with foundations because that's often a place where there's committed funds when you're thinking about, something that is that rare. One other plug that I want to make for foundations, I've had several foundation-based grants and awards, particularly when I was a junior investigator. The commitment goes beyond the funding often, and that makes a tremendous difference. The fact that foundations call you as an investigator and want to know what the results are and what are the studies that you're finding and how is that student doing who was working on this project and what are the next steps. It both validates the important work that you're doing as a scientist, which sometimes feels like it's happening in a vacuum, and it also re-emphasizes the importance of the work that's going on. I think so advocacy and funding in the pediatric foundations. Let's talk about the NIH for a minute. The NIH supports research in a whole variety of ways. F awards are early career training. K awards are a little bit later in training. R awards are independent solo projects. P awards are collaborative projects. And U awards are contracts. I'm happy to talk about any of that in the Q&A. But that's where it starts to get really messy about how much do we support for pediatric cancer research. The coding is messy at best, and there are research opportunities that are happening that are in the theme of pediatric cancer research that are not clearly marked as so, but I would also agree that more pediatric cancer research is absolutely necessary. And so that's been an area of focus to try to really know where and when and how we're putting money into cancer research. A big step in that direction came from the STAR Act. So the STAR Act is an important mandate from members of Congress that requires an allocation of funds toward pediatric cancer research. That's actually was a really valuable part of our budget. It's not new money, but it tells you that at least this amount of funds must be dedicated solely for pediatric cancer research. And for both basic research and there was an important component of survivorship research as well, which is really important because we do have a lot of kids who are cured with their cancers, but go on to have medical needs, and that's an important part of how we care for people in the whole longer term. And so that puts structure around groups of grants, and I'm a fan of structured granting programs that brings different groups together to be working on a common goal. I will also say that we fund the pediatric oncology branch, which is the probably the most busy and productive part of the NCI. They're a very well-oiled machine. They one big win just from last year was the development of an NF1 treatment that was made commercially available last year that came from decades of research that came from the pediatric oncology branch. But they don't only work on internal projects. They are very interested in projects that are outwardly facing, like the My Part program, which engages patients and families so that we can, learn in a more community-based way about what's happening in pediatric cancer space. And then the other, which I think is a really important thing to know about, is the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative and the Molecular Characterization Initiative. So this is an initiative that was initially part of the Cancer Moonshot Cures Act funding, but had additional supplemental funds that were put into it. It actually was started in the Trump's first administration. It's a 10-year initiative, so $500 million. This is new money that was put in to accelerate pediatric cancer research. I got into this as NCI director late and was able to see the real effect of what this data initiative, by bringing all of the different pediatric threads of data together so that there could be a lot more data sharing and understanding when you're looking across these many rare tumors, to be able to see themes that can start to emerge. Adding the Molecular Characterization Initiative, which is doing DNA and RNA testing on roughly 3,000 patients per year, allows us to learn much more comprehensively about these cancers, about some of their genetic underpinnings, about the ways in which they're formed, so that we can understand whether there are environmental exposures that are linked to them, or if there are, other reasons to understand these cancers. This is a very data-driven approach, and one of the things that we did in the last year was we brought on a new deputy for data science and data integration and strategy. His name's Warren Kibbe, and he's a big data scientist. And so we put him in charge, even though he's not particularly a pediatric person, but he brought all the pediatricians in and was able to make the data really start to move because of the knowledge in data science. So those are sort of the big structures that we think about. But in order to make a big difference, and this I'm going to go through kind of quickly because I used the same framework just a couple of days ago at the AACR, is a framework for how we think about making big moves forward, like making advances for pediatric cancer. So I've been talking at cancer centers and groups for the last couple of months, and thinking about when there are big cuts in funding and challenges in our workforce, and how do we continue to engage the population in understanding the real value in cancer research, so that people are knowing that some of the things that we do today in pediatric cancer care, 10 years ago, we would have said, no, that would take a miracle. But today is normal, and today is a part of what we do. I mean, I look at CAR T therapy, and CAR T therapy is really starting to make some more inroads in pediatric cancer cases. 10 years ago, that was really the whole field, very much almost a pipe dream. The thought that it could actually be comprehensively used for lots of different diseases in lots of different scenarios and taken almost to an off-the-shelf kind of level, incomprehensible. Today, we completely expect that. And while it's not quite there for all the diseases, it is so close. And getting one by one, we're getting new opportunities where CAR Ts, as just one example among many, 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 is a technology that's there and ready. So engaging the community means telling our story and telling it over and over. Engaging with new communities, you all do this really well. Making sure that the public and others know what it is that we're doing and why it's so important. Developing our workforce, because we have to have a workforce that does this. Doubling down on creativity and innovation, and then exactly what this consortium does is uniting on common themes so that we can speak with louder voices. So I'm just going to take a minute and walk through each. And of course, so telling the stories. I have learned as a scientist, and this has taken me many years, that leading with facts. I love to lead with facts. I like figures. I love a graph because then I know there's a trend, and I know that two data points is not enough. You need enough to make a line. That's all ingrained in me. But I also know that if you want to make a difference in a way that people remember, you have to tell stories and you have to put it all the way together. And so I think we as scientists have to learn how to do that. You all do that really well and have compelling stories and can both help us be better and can help us with stories that are necessary and important to be told. So I'm going to tell you a follow-up story to the story of my patient who got me started. So that got started by having this meeting that I told you about. At that meeting, I co-led it with a guy from MD Anderson, and we were both as committed as we could be to renal medullary carcinoma. I will say he started a big clinic that was focused on rare kidney tumors. I was really focused on laboratory advances, and we made lots of good advances. I would say we made it was hard. Renal medullary carcinoma was a tough nut for us to crack, and so we made, I would say, modest advances in that space. But he was at the time training a fellow, a young guy named Pavlos Masul, and Pavlos took an interest. He was not even far enough along in training to have come to that original meeting. I think he was probably a glimmer in someone's eye as a fellow, right? But he came to my colleague's clinic, and also we were, getting this foundation up and running, and so heard about it, heard about some of the science, went through his training entirely with this fascination that this was a disease that he thought he must have a skill set that could help. And he today is an assistant professor. He's at MD Anderson. He's making some of the really most impactful discoveries in his laboratory. Has brought forward this opportunity for screening that I mentioned before, and has 2 R01s from the NIH to study renal medullary carcinoma. So he previously had funding from a foundation and then a DoD. So you start with, finding the right person or people ideally, and investing in their skill set as well as their passion, and enabling them to be able to get started. And he's now grown that to where it's sustainable, and it's a program that is really destined to make a huge impact in this disease, as well as discoveries that will impact many, many others. So I'm really proud that he's taken up the mantle, but he's not the only one. There are others as well who are also fascinated and taking up this rare tumor. So engaging our communities, I think one of the things that I have been really trying to endorse, especially when I talk to groups of scientists, is that we have to balance listening with talking. So hopefully when we get to the Q&A, I know that I will learn from what these questions are. I always do, as much as I hope you can learn from the discussion. I think making it clear that outreach is one thing, but engagement is very different, and that scientists and physicians and people passionate about cancer research have to engage with our community. Also to show the passion that this is not something that we do for any other reason than that it's purely mission driven, and that we put all of our talents together for that, and that can be compelling when people see it in action. And then also engaging the communities is a part of building the team. It's a part of inspiring some of that interest among young kids who are in elementary and middle school, young people in high school. That's where our talent comes from. Scientists don't just emerge in sophomore year in college. They come from recognition that there are things beyond our known universe that they're out there to discover, and particularly in the biomedical sciences, and in particular in places where we can make a big difference in people's lives. I always put this in for the scientists, but I put it in for everybody because I think it just speaks to the fact that most of what we do is talk to groups who know what we're talking about. And even when we go out on places like social media, our friend network is people who know us, and it's actually talking outside, which is really most important. I'll just take 1 second on developing our workforce. None of this work can happen if we don't have a really strong workforce. And I think the story of this young investigator who decided to take on renal medullary carcinoma really speaks to it. It's really finding, equipping, and positioning the champion. And you can't invest in only one, right? None of us would, identify someone very early on and say, you are going to be the next NBA player, right? We invest in lots of people so that they can develop, and some will become NBA players and some will be in the business of basketball. So I think really just knowing that it's the people that are going to get us to those places, as well as having to have funding to support them, but we have to have the people who do it. And our young people, they're the ones who stand the most to benefit. So I think the workforce is super important. Doubling down on creativity and innovation. This is in science, but in how we do our science and what we do. I think of it in terms of a virtuous cycle of asking bolder questions, pushing out boundaries, thinking out of the box. I mean, things that I know you want to see in all of these areas, but just a few examples in an era where the climate is more challenging, where finances are particularly tight, is it requires additional creativity and being creative around the types of trials that we do. Learning to do trials where we don't have to have the large randomized trial because we know exactly what the genetic underpinning is. And so I'm going to tell you one more quick story. So I'm a kidney cancer person, so I've studied von Hippel-Lindau disease for a long time. That's the rare disease where I've had probably the most influence. And I run a von Hippel-Lindau disease clinic. They all have a mutation in this one gene called von Hippel-Lindau. And as we learned what the mechanism was for why that caused cancer in these folks, eventually there was a drug that could turn off that switch. And so where do you do that? We actually had evolved really good ways of making sure that none of those patients, or very few of them, ever went on to metastatic disease. So it's not reasonable that we would study this in late stage metastatic disease. And so we've worked with the FDA to get the drug to be tested in these patients who had known hereditary mutations in this gene, who had known what the course of the cancer's growth were like, and who were willing to be a part of this study. It was a 42 patient study and led to the approval of a drug that now is a game changer for that disease. Those cancers now don't grow. A once a day drug keeps them from having to have repeated surgical procedures. And so that's a great example of when we know what we're doing, because we know the science, we can make real inroads in a much smaller, much, much, much cheaper trial with an even bigger outcome. And then, what this consortium does is exactly what I put in this example, is uniting in common themes. Of course, the analogy is the one stick is breakable, but you bind them together in a bundle and it's suddenly not. And that this kind of cooperation allows for much bigger impact. uh, and a way that we can acknowledge and confront some of the biggest issues, whether they're around gaps or building reliances or confronting some of the economic realities all together. And so I like this framework because I think if we put it all together, we can envision a future that has much more clarity around what the issues are around cancer, one where the community is a partner and not a client in the sense of healthcare delivery, where our workforce is a strong and robust pipeline because the young folks are engaged, and where it's exciting because we ask bold questions and we are creative in how we accomplish this, and then can speak with a common voice around issues that are so important to us, like making advances for pediatric cancer. So that is where I will stop. Just saying advancing health for our children is our responsibility. That's kind of gets to point number 5. And I will stop my slides so that we can have a conversation.
You, Dr. Ratnal, that was really amazing, and something that really spoke out to me is the component about outreach and engagement. And this goes back to our earlier conversation, how I approached you. It was a random message on LinkedIn. You with so much you listened to me. You agreed to come and talk in our webinars, and I'm so grateful for that, right? Because we can all learn so much from, you're already practicing what you're talking about. So that's what I just wanted to bring out to the community here, that it's not just words. You actually did that to be able to come and talk to this to this community. So thank you for that. We have a few questions, but I just want to have one question that is like really important to me, and I would like you to address that before I get on to the community questions. How might the proposed NIH caps on indirect, cost reimbursements of 15% affect pediatric cancer research, right? Given that we already get so much little and very few people are already doing pediatric cancer research. Like,
Yeah, I'm really happy to take that one on because I think it's a real issue, and one, that was a topic of that appropriations committee that I mentioned that's just been happening. So lots of people are interested in this. So first, just to kind of lay out the field, there's a lot of support that's required to make it possible to be able to do a research project. So when you write a grant and say, oh, I want to study this molecular pathway in these tissues, and then I want to use some mice to validate it, and then I'm going to do something with some blood tests from patients. Okay, that's sort of a common basic components of a grant, right? You can't do that without first of all, you have to have a space where you work, and you have to have all the parts of the business. You have to have an HR team and an IT team and a facilities team and people who manage your budgets and accounting, all of those people. So all that has to be there. You also have to have some basic equipment. The grants typically fund some of the personnel effort and the supplies. They don't support the equipment. They don't support the computer that you're working on. They don't support the travel when you go to meetings. There's often a tiny travel budget, but not nearly. It's almost a token amount. The rest of it comes from other places. So that's what indirect cost is. Also the compliance, making sure that it meets the expectations of whatever the award is. And that's compliance from the government for the grant, but also if I just described a project that had mice, that's the mouse colony space, that's the compliance with the animal oversight committees, that's the compliance because I mentioned, blood draws from patients, the IRB. Okay, so you get the picture. Like there's a lot of different pieces. They all cost a little bit of money. And so the overhead or the indirect cost goes into supporting all that part. And there's a agency in the HHS or a office in the HHS that negotiates that rate with an institution. And it's variable. Just the same way it costs a different amount sometimes because live in one part of the country or another part. Real estate is different. The supplies are cost different, like different things cost. Okay, so that's where the big range probably comes from. Are all those numbers completely accurate and fair? That's probably worth discussion. Okay. Does anyone think 15% is the right number? That's probably not right either. The challenge that comes is it says the comparison to some foundation grants that cap their own awards at numbers like 10 and 12 or 15%. And we know that we're losing money on those grants often. And so those are probably not right either. And the reason we at institutions accept those grants is because they're sort of unique or special. Some of you may have foundations that give grants that award a smaller indirect cost, and we're allowing for the fact that it will lose some of that funds. And sometimes those grants will allow for expenditure that the NIH doesn't. So sometimes you can buy a computer or the other components go into the grant. So sometimes there's some of it's apples and oranges, some of it is just an inequity that is true in the system, and we should probably address. So what would happen if it abruptly went to 15%? That would be, that would be a lot of money coming out of the system very suddenly. So I think that's where the anxiety comes from, is institutions trying to manage how they would make such a rapid course correction when they were going from a number that I think the average number comes in around more in like 45 or 50%. So that's a big difference. So that's why I think people really want to, take a minute and figure out how we would actually utilize these funds. I think everyone's on the same page of wanting to use all the funds to support research. It's just we have to recognize that the support part for research is significant.
Is it going to like really deter younger researchers or younger investigators from studying
uh,
rare disease when they don't have that much money, and now that you're
right.
removing even the infrastructure costs associated with it, and indirect in my head directly going to affect the trajectory of research that is going into
Yeah.
innovation in pediatric cancer.
Yeah, so specifically for rare disease or pediatric cancer research, it's just whenever the system gets tighter, some things fall out, and I would be worried that it could be affecting um, grants that are around um, uh, uh, smaller target audience cancers. Not by any design. I think just because if you lost 10% of research in breast cancer, that would be just a smaller number of a lot of people. If you lost 10% of the two people doing some
Yeah.
research in a rare type, like that probably leads one of them to be gone. And so that's where just the small numbers game doesn't work in your favor here.
Thank you for that. We have a question from the audience. Pradeep Singh's asking, I'm just going to paraphrase his question, is about it's more about the CCDI project, about standardizing and creating a common data element dictionary
Yep.
where you have various different types of files and stuff. How do you what kind of systems are in place to study these rare cancers, given that there are BAM files, there are MRI files, and every
Yep.
institution has their own different versions of it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that's one of the first things that Warren Kippy did when he came in, was to try to be more systematic in the data that was coming in. He's a big proponent, and across the NCI, actually really championed by Monica Bertagnoli, even before she was at the NCI, is the use of common data elements and having common terminologies so that so that this data is more easily transferable and that we can apply uh, conventions across sort of space and time. I think the data in the CCDI takes advantage of the fact that a lot of pediatric cancer patients are part of community oncology or ch ch COG, um,
Children's Group
Children's
of
Oncology Group
Yeah.
clinical trials already. So they are connected um, uh, in ways that we don't see in the adult population. So it's a tremendous opportunity to bring that data together. So it was easier to do in pediatrics, but it makes more sense to do in pediatrics as well. And the same thing with and so the data as it gets entered, there's structured fields and requirements to make it forced into alignment as it comes together. So it's a really rich data set. And then the molecular analysis is all being done centrally, so it's all done on one platform.
Okay. Thank you for that. Just speaking of data, I'm going to jump to Daniela's question. She's asking about how can you share more information about how AI is being utilized in research and clinical trials, patient modeling, and how is this helping to advance research?
Oh my goodness. So AI is in almost everything that we do, and that was the big impetus behind knowing that we needed a deputy for data science because the AI. So for example, this is not specific to pediatric cancer, although pediatric cancers were pretty well represented in the Human Tissue Atlas Network, Human Tumor Atlas Network, which was a three-dimensional imaging of tissue. And it's not just pictures. It came with a suite of AI tools so that investigators could utilize those tools and apply them to understand how different cell types were interacting with each other. It's a beautiful visual into what's going on inside a tumor in a way that we never could do before. It's publicly accessible, by the way. It's anybody can go in and use those tools and interrogate those data sets. So, that's one example. We're seeing this in how we apply to imaging to be able to see early tumors that we might have missed before, but also in pathology and even in patient record. So there's almost never a project that involves any data where there's not a component that we're doing some AI enablement because the data is so massive that's the only way to find the patterns that could emerge.
Thank you. Vicky Ringer is asking that it also seems like the advocacy offices in NIH and NCI are being degraded. How can advocates keep having their united voice being heard if there aren't any staff that are supporting?
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that question. So I will first be honest that I don't know exactly the details of what's been happening since I left the NCI. I do know people who have been affected by the reduction in force who were part of the advocacy workforce. So I know that there are fewer people. I just don't know the scale or the exact context. I think that's a major issue. The uh, the need for advocacy voice on a daily basis at the NCI is really, really important, and having fewer people who can really speak to that, who can help, a director or others be, aware of the impact of decisions that they might be making, or places where they might be able to get more community support if they um, uh, uh, launched or took a program in a particular direction. I mean, those kinds of insights I found to be absolutely invaluable. And it can't be one person. You need a team that's well connected to all of you and to other parts of the advocacy community. So I found it really, really valuable. And as some of you know, was looking for other ways that we could have more engagement with our advocacy community, including in our grant review.
Thank you for that. Phil Tan's asking, with the changing landscape of federal funding, foundations will become more involved in funding clinical trials. What does it cost for doing a clinical trial in cancer, particularly a phase one?
Oh, goodness. So yeah, funding clinical trials is it's a big business. So it costs a lot to do clinical trials because it's very labor intensive. There's a it's not only a doctor's time and the nurses, but there's a lot of people behind the scenes with the regulatory components and the data science, et cetera. So um, as foundations start to think about clinical trials, it is really important to think about what kinds of clinical trials. Uh, Clinical studies get very expensive when they are long, when they have a lot of, I call them bells and whistles, so lots of extra samples and biomarkers and extra imaging tests. Uh, when I was running clinical trials, I always loved doing those things until I got the price tag and then realized, you had to be really smart. And this is where you have to be, the creative and innovative part is not just how innovative would it be to do, 5 PET scans, but, could we answer the question with a particular type of PET scan at just the right time? Um, uh, and and so I think you have to really just know what the exact questions are that you want to address. I threw on my slide the bespoke clinical trials, right? Really focused, like the ultimate in precision medicine, right? We know the gene in the patient and the treatment modality that we want to put all together. Those kinds of studies can either be outrageously expensive or not that bad, but it all depends on what the modality is and what the options are for the patient. That's not a good answer. It could be all over the map is the answer.
So speaking of clinical trials, just like with the reduction at the FDA, right? With the streamlining of the FDA there, how might the delay impact innovation or actually
Yeah.
coming to the patient population that needs it now? Uh,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the easy answer for that is time is money. And that's always true. It's there are real reasons sometimes to build in caution, so that we're taking things at an appropriate pace. But every month that something is delayed, it either impacts the revenue, it adds to the cost of the preparation, and then it's later for an individual patient. So the uh, efficiency is a way to make money go further.
Okay. We have Dean Crow asking a few questions. She has the first one is what specific cuts in addition to the 15% cuts are on pediatric cancer that is enduring at the NCI NIH level right now?
So I don't so that's a little bit of a hard question to answer. I think there's a lot of different things that are coming through in the media. There are some grants that have been cut because they were um, uh, um, studying populations in ways that didn't uh, allow them to continue. So those grants um, were were um, were sometimes terminated. That there's a list online, so that's one way that kind of thing is happening. I don't know of anything that's directly um, targeting pediatric cancer. It's mostly the sort of widespread slowdown is going to affect things overall. I think there's a lot of anxiety about um, the fact that the budget is in a continuing resolution. So that means that it's a flat budget, but it's a flat budget with fewer people to support some of the work. A flat budget always actually costs a little bit more for us because our expenses go up like everybody else's expenses. in the government, and so it actually there's less sort of money to give out in grants when it's flat. So the cut comes in sort of that form, and then we're all watching for what fiscal year 26 looks like in terms of the levels of funding.
Follow-up questions to along the clinical trials, also by Dean, was like, do you know of any specific pediatric clinical trials that has been paused or not open due to the current climate?
I do not know, and that's partly because I'm not actively in practice or there, so I just don't have access to that information.
So, and Dean's also a last question from her is that in regards to the 15% indirect cost, do you believe that the current administration would be willing to get in the room to negotiate? I said there's a congressional hearing about that. And is there any movement towards like happening to for the discussion of the 15% amount that is being cut?
Yeah, I don't know exactly where the state of things are. I can say that even back when I was in office, this was something not 15%, but the how much should the indirect cost rate be was a very regular topic that came up for discussion. So and I and it is regularly negotiated. So I would suspect that there would be broad support for an active discussion about what's the right way to support the research in a way that allows it to be able to happen.
I think there's a parent, Oscar, who wants to come off and ask a question directly. Oscar, if you want to like come off mute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you, Misha, and thank you, Doctor, for being
Hi.
on.
Mhm.
Hello. You know, being silent, I'm the son of Cuban exiles who lost their country because people were quiet, and it's happened throughout history. This is such an injustice for the community that's on this call, and for you people as well who dedicated your life to. You guys don't go into this work to make money. Let's be honest. You're really smart, capable people who, if money was your ultimate outcome, would head in a different direction. Um, these cuts have been made out indiscriminately, without true consideration for the implications. You know, and we as an advocacy community are subject to the same challenges you guys are on the research side, government, academia. Just small population sizes create difficulty creating more awareness. So, in light of all that, how do we, and I guess this is probably for the entire group, how do we create better messaging to shame? Because there's no politician that would stand in front of this group and say, there's a position pro making these cuts. I mean, this is so critically important that it's going to cost lives. I mean, a lot of these cuts are going to cost lives, but these are kids,
Mhm.
who are already up against the eight ball. How can we collectively come together to raise the alarm? Because this is, I mean, there's a lot of aspects that are wrong with what are happening, but as we focus on this, how can we amplify our voices to a point to say this is so damn wrong. Um, and many of us on this call have already lost children, and we're here because we want to make sure that the chances are improved,
Mhm.
not worsened for the people in the future. That's not the way this is supposed to be. And as much as we're all going to work hard to try to fill the gap as foundations, let's be honest,
Right.
that's not something that's going to happen overnight. And even through time, there aren't enough resources. So I'm sorry, I needed to
Mhm.
pontificate for a second, but how do we come together as a group and amplify our voice? Because there's nobody who would stand in front of us and say it's okay that their decisions are okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's I think you spoke to exactly the issue with a really passionate voice, and I know that I have never met anyone who is not absolutely wanting for cancer to be different, for everyone to experience less, and to have cancer research lead the way. How we do that is hard, and that's why I've been really talking to people about talking about really helping to amplify um, some of the urgency of the issue today, to recognize that are there things that we could do differently or better. Any organization or industry field goes through evolutions. That's true, but how do we not uh, you know have something that happens catastrophically so that we lose a generation of researchers? That's what I am top of my mind worried about. Or derail research enough that it takes years to get it back up and going. That's I think part of the story and that we have to tell. And I worry about using the word story because story sounds like somehow it's fictional. It's more it's the what's the narrative of the whole experience that's happening when funding is very acutely drying up from something that was so impactful and so important for all of our health and well-being.
We
But
have
I guess the thing I'll say is that I'm glad that you're all here, right? I think that it's you all being able to work together, but also to help to let people know how really vitally important this work is.
Thank you, Dr. Atma. We have another question. As a research foundation, in your opinion, how can we best support our research community during this time? Funding more emerging investigation, funding more, like removing indirect funding restrictions, etc. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I want to amplify in that one thing that Oscar said, which is that I think foundations are looking to try to step up and fill in some of the gap. That gap is really big, and so it would be I think impossible to replace the federal government. It's an ecosystem that requires all of the various components, and the federal support is the foundational part. So, in terms of filling in the gap, I think that early career investigators is an important place to start because those are the people who will have the longest runway as long as they are managed to stay in or early or early-ish, right? I think that uh, we really will have a bigger problem than any of us anticipate if a whole generation is gone, and suddenly we're starting from scratch out in the future. And so that's why I think that investing in early career is probably where funds can go the furthest. But there's also there are lots of other important things that can make real advances, particularly channeling around a rare disease type that appears to have like the right momentum to be able to move all the way into something that's a reliable treatment. So there are conditions that are sort of right at that ripe edge that might be the place as well that's worth that kind of investment, both because it shows what the effect is, but also because that's like a level of momentum that we absolutely don't want to lose.
Um, Thank you, Dr. Atmal. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but I have another question that I would ask you
Okay.
that since I'm being greedy here, you've already agreed to spend a little more time with us. I'm going to take this opportunity to ask this question. I'm new. I lost my son in 2021. Some of these advocates have been fighting the fight for a really long time before I've come. For me, it's still that why does pediatric oncology still receive between 6 and 8% of federal funding? And I know this is not your take because you talked about that we should study these cancers more, but traditionally we've been receiving such little funding where the kids are, I want to say, 100% of our future, and we're still investing less in pediatrics. And also a way is like, how do we efficiently use our voices, not in this political climate, but just like in general, right? Pediatric cancer is so underfunded. How do advocates use this to address this disparity?
Yeah. Well, I think actually the example of the young investigator that I told you about is one good one, which is to support somebody who um, you see as having really, really good ideas. Okay. And I say that because the current system really just rewards based on it the ideas and how exciting are they, how impactful will they be, and how likely are they to work, right? That's what our peer review system tends to reward. There's sort of a sense that impact means most number of patients affected, but that's actually not entirely true. That's and the reviewers are encouraged not to think of it that way, but to think of impact pretty broadly. And so in that example of that young investigator, the early support that got him and developed the ideas that he had, he competed in the regular pool to get 2 different R01s funded. So the funding is there, but you have to have the people who are bringing sort of the best as well as realistic ideas forward. And that sounds like, well, how do you know what the sort of what the best ideas are? But I think as you get to know investigators, you can smell the snake oil salesman from the ones who have something that's solid, that is an idea that could lead to a real discovery that is game changing. So.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Atmal. If we have no more questions, I'd like to say, really, this has been so informative for me as a patient advocate, listening to a different perspective. I am so grateful for your time, and I just want to say thank you. And I hope we collectively can make a change in this political climate and do something that is right for our kids, right? We cannot keep losing programs, even at the NCI level. The priority review voucher is such an important piece of legislation, and that is at risk. It's not yet being funded. And this is something that we totally need to address. And your inputs on how to effectively use our collective voices is going to be totally important in this administration. Thank you so much, Dr. Atmal.
Right. Thank you.
Before I let everybody go, just to remind you, we have an upcoming webinar on May 13th on fertility, hope in childhood cancer survivors. Please register to learn about fertility preservation in childhood cancer. Thank you, everybody.